Video is for Julie, and I wanted to review some important geometry ideas, things that you see every single day. There are two words that we did talk about. One was parallel, and the other one was perpendicular. I sometimes like to look at what words mean, and it sometimes helps me to remember them better. So, parallel is Greek for parallelios, which means beside each other. So when we look at parallel lines, they will be beside each other. But more importantly, they will never cross because they're facing the same direction. So if we take a quick look at all the different places we see parallel lines, clotheslines, train tracks, the lines on the road, we'll notice that they are something we use every single day to build and to really help us as human beings in the constructions that we make and the designs that we also make. So the football field and poles on the street and the lines on the track, you see them on the pages and cover and back cover of a book. So parallel lines are very, very common, and they are used all the time throughout geometry, just like in life. So another word that we talked about was perpendicular. It's a weird word, perpendicular. And perpendicular is Latin. Greek and Latin typically are where we get a lot of the weird words we see in science and math. And it has to do with the plumb line, or making a right angle to the horizon. So a plumb line is when you hang an object on a piece of string, it's always going to be perpendicular or make a right angle to the ground, because gravity will make the string go completely perpendicular to both the ground and to where you're holding it. So a perpendicular line has to do with what the lines are doing, but when we look at it as an angle, we say that they make right angles. So let's take a quick look at perpendicular lines in nature. So we see them all the time. They make a corner. When you're going straight and you make a right-hand turn or a left-hand turn, same thing that you see on the streets, you make a right angle. We see them on the corner of our pictures here. We see them on the corner of your paper, the corner of your street. We also see them in train tracks and on signs, and really they help us build things. If our table legs weren't perpendicular, the table wouldn't sit as steady. When you're building a house, if it's not perpendicular, it's not going to be as steady. So quiz yourself. What would these lines be, assuming that they were completely facing the same direction? And those are parallel. So when we are going one direction and make a right turn, we call this as lines, we call them perpendicular lines. But another word we talked about was as an angle. How much is this angle open? And we call that a right angle. And we'll talk more about angles in a minute. So perpendicular lines are used to help us when we're building things so that gravity doesn't push them down. When we build a house, we need the angles to be right angles. We need perpendicular lines. And then the house will stand straight. If the house was leaning over, it might even look neat. But the problem is, throughout time, it'll actually make the house keep leaning over more and more, because gravity will push down on it. And when gravity's pushing down on something perpendicular, it'll actually stay in place. So that's why when we balance a pencil or a pen, when it's standing on a table, it will be perpendicular, and that will balance it. But if the pen was leaning over, it's going to fall over immediately as soon as you let go. So perpendicular lines are very important for building things, because they make them strong and steady, and they help them fight against gravity. There's a very famous tower called the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and it actually leans, and every year or every so many years they have to reinforce it. Now they could make it straight so that it doesn't keep leaning, but the tourists like to come see it. So this tower, because the gravity is pushing it gravity's pushing downwards, because the tower's leaning over, every year it keeps leaning more and more over until they correct it. But again, if it was standing straight and it was perpendicular to the ground, then it wouldn't have that problem. So perpendicular lines, you can call them out when you see them when you're driving and you'll remember them, but they're very important to geometry and the concepts of geometry. So those are the examples of parallel lines and perpendicular lines, and a little bit of why they're important, or at least the perpendicular lines are very important for building.